It's time to turn our attention to Keats' poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. And once again, anytime you read any fictional text, or any non-fictional text for that matter, you always want to pay attention to the title, because the title is very important. Also, whenever you read a poem, including the title of a poem, you want to make sure you pay attention to every word, because every word is important. Poets select their words extremely carefully, choosing each word with a mind to its denotative meaning, the dictionary meaning, but also the connotative meaning, which is the associated emotional loading that's attached to the word by a culture. So this is an ode, obviously. An ode is a poem that follows a regular stanza construction, as we saw with Ode to a Nightingale. This is an ode on a Grecian urn. And so we do need to address that, because we have certain cultural associations that apply now that mislead people into reading that word incorrectly. Now we tend to associate urns with funereal urns, urns that are used to store the ashes of deceased people who have been cremated. But that would not have been appropriate to understand this urn. This is a Grecian urn. And a Grecian urn would have been a large clay pot or a large clay vase that was used to store food, like grain or olive oil or wine. Or it could have been, and in the case of this one probably was, a decorative urn. It was created, elaborately decorated, and then used for decoration. And as decorations, Greek urns could be very elaborate. They could have highly stylized or even very detailed images glazed into the surface of the urn. In fact, Keats himself drew this urn that he found in a museum, showing the kinds of urns in which he was interested. The images on the urn that Keats described are fringed with a design of leaves like twining vines. He says, "What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape?" And so there's a fringe of leaves around the design. The first image that he describes on the side of the urn is an image of men chasing women. He says, "What men or gods are these? What maidens loath?" Which means, what men are these chasing women who are loath to be caught, who don't want to be caught? Then if we rotate the urn, he shows a piper piping under the trees while a separate lover is about to kiss his beloved. If you rotate the urn one more time, he shows a group of villagers who have left their village to lead a heifer. A heifer is an unbred female cow, to an altar for a sacrifice to the gods. So this urn was most likely a decorative urn of the kind that Keats himself drew and that one might expect to see in a museum. The last thing I want to look at in the title is this is Ode on a Grecian Urn. Now, Ode to a Nightingale was deliberately described in the title as an address to the bird. This is Ode on a Grecian Urn. And although this poem is an apostrophe, it does start off talking to the urn. Nevertheless, the title tells us something different. On in English has two meanings. The first meaning is about. So this is an ode about a Grecian urn. You'll notice that in other languages, Spanish for instance, the two different prepositions that on means in English are split into two separate words. The second meaning is ode is on means on the surface of, like on a table. Both meanings apply here. So this is an ode about an artwork in this case, on the surface of the urn. Keats is going to be talking about the art, the ode, except in another form, visual art, as it is depicted on the surface of the urn. In the first stanza, the poet addresses, and as he addresses, describes the first image on the vase. "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than a rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals or both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? So, as we mentioned before, the poet starts off by addressing the vase as thou still unravished bride of quietness. And this is quite a dense line. Still here has two possible meanings. The first meaning means unmoving, which is appropriate for this because the vase is still. It's a foster child of silence and slow time, as he says in the next line. Where would one expect to find a Greek vase now or in Keats' time? Well, it most likely would be in a museum or in an art studio or in the collection of some wealthy collector. And so it's probably, unlike its original use, now being consigned to slow time, to the kind of slow passage of time that one would expect of objects in a museum. It also is a still unravished bride. So what is an unravished bride? What is a still unravished bride? In the Catholic Church and in the Church of England, a wedding is not official until the marriage is consummated. In other words, up until the moment that the wedding is consummated, the marriage can be dissolved by the church. Once the wedding is consummated, the bride and groom can no longer get an annulment through the church. And the church, the Catholic Church, doesn't recognize divorce. So in Catholic theology, you are married to the first person you slept with. So a still unravished bride of quietness is a bride who has gone through the wedding ceremony, but it has not yet been consummated. She has not been ravished, and therefore she's in a liminal state. Remember that we defined a liminal state. A limen is a threshold as a state in between two conditions. So she's almost a bride, but not quite. And so how is the urn an unravished bride of quietness? What would it take to make the urn completely married to quietness? Well, obviously the urn can't speak anymore if it's broken. So a ravished bride of quietness would be broken, literally ravaged in this case, and then would be completely married to quietness. So the urn, in this case, the bride, is almost married to quietness by being in the museum, but not completely married to quietness, which would happen if it were broken. The next line says, thou foster child of silence and slow time. Okay, so what's a foster child? We tend to think about foster children as children who are temporarily living with foster parents. In Keats's time, any adopted child would be described as a foster child. So the urn has been adopted by silence and slow time. So who are its biological parents? Well, its biological parents are obviously the Greeks in Greek society. In Greek society, it would have been used. It would have been part of the society, but it has now been adopted by the silence and slow time of museum life. And why is that the case? Well, because its biological parents, the ancient Greeks, are dead. So its biological parents are dead and now has been adopted by silence and slow time in the museum. Sylvan historian. Sylvan is glossed below. It's the rural forest life. So it's describing the forest life. But it's also an historian. So what's an historian? An historian, we tend to think of it as something that tells us about the past. And that certainly applies here. The urn is telling us about the past that it represents. But a historian is also, in a broader sense, an historian is anyone who tells stories. The Sylvan historian, in other words, this urn is an historian telling us a story about the past of a rural life in the forest, in this case, a pastoral rural life. And we talked about the pastoral in detail when we talked about Ode to a Nightingale. It's that world of timelessness without sickness, illness, or death. And that's the world about which this vase will tell us stories. Who can thus express, because it's an historian, it can thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than a rhyme. So how is it that the urn is able to tell a story more sweetly than the poet's efforts? And that question will be answered in the next lines. As he points out at the end, this is a colon. A colon means what follows the colon renames what comes before. So the next lines are going to explain how it can express a tale more sweetly than a rhyme. So he says, What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, if deities or mortals or both, and Tempe are the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? You'll notice that all of these things are questions. He asks a series of questions. How can he claim that the urn, because it leads us to ask these questions, tells a tale more sweetly than the rhyme? And he'll answer that in the next stanza. So what are these questions asking? The first one is, what leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape? Okay, so what's a legend? Leaf-fringed because it has a leafy border, as we said. What's a legend? Well, a legend has three relevant meanings here, all of which Keats is using. The first meaning is, of course, a story of uncertain truth, like the legend of King Arthur. Usually a story of the past, one which has not been verified by history, sort of a myth. The second meaning is, as you're familiar with, if you've ever looked at a map, a legend is the key to reading the symbols of the map. In other words, we use the legend to explain what's going on elsewhere. And then the third meaning comes from the root word of legend. In Latin, the word legend comes from the word leyenda, which means things which must be read. This urn, to unpack this line, is telling us a story of the past, or a myth, which is a key to understanding something other than the poem itself. In this case, our relationship with art and truth, which must be read. And so the next questions are all attempts to read the urn, read the story of the urn. So what men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? He's looking at the picture on the urn, and he's trying to figure out what these things are. And so he's asking the questions, but of course the urn, being inanimate, can't answer. In the second stanza, the poet turns to the next picture on the urn, and this is the picture which shows a piper under the trees piping a song, while another man, not the piper, is about to kiss his beloved. So at the beginning of the stanza, he addresses the piper. He says, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone." Okay, so how are heard melodies less sweet than unheard melodies? Well, what is an unheard melody? An unheard melody would be one that you hear in your imagination. And why is it sweeter than a heard melody? Because in your imagination it can be perfect. When you're listening to a melody in reality through your ear, it's limited by the performance of the artist. And it's also limited by the fact that it must end. No artist can play forever. But an unheard melody in your imagination can play on forever, and it can be absolutely perfect. Unheard melody, something that pipes directly to the imagination, is better than a heard melody. And he says, as a result, therefore ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear. What's the sensual ear? Well, it's our actual physical ear, our auditory canal leading to our auditory nerve leading to our brain. Not to the physical ear of senses, but more endeared, because it's sweeter, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. So in this particular case, unheard music is played directly to the imagination. Unheard music is played directly to the imagination, and therefore it is sweeter and more endeared. And then in the same picture, he has the young lover about to kiss his beloved. Now, you need to be careful because some of the online glosses will claim that the piper and the lover are the same person, but there's two reasons this is unlikely. The first one is simply practical. Anyone who's ever tried to play a wind instrument knows that one cannot kiss another person while playing a wind instrument. And since these people are frozen on the surface of the urn, he's got the wind instrument to his mouth blowing it. Therefore, he can't be about to kiss someone. It would be in the way. It's a good thing he's not playing a tuba or a French horn, I guess, or a trombone. Okay, the second reason is that he says, "Fair youth beneath the trees," this is the piper, "thou canst not leave thy song." So if you can't leave your song, that means he's never going to be in a position where he's about to kiss his beloved because he's always playing the pipes. And then he turns to the bold lover, who is separate from the fair youth playing the pipes. "Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal. So he's about to kiss her, but he's frozen on the urn just at the moment, just before the kiss. How is this moment better than a real kiss? He says, "Yet do not grieve, she cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair." Well, in the real world, a kiss has to end. In the real world, your kiss is going to end and your beloved is going to grow old and die. The world preserved in its perfect moment, at the moment of perfection in art, is superior to the mortal world where the beloved will fade because she will always be fair and he will always love her. Also, if you think about it in another way, the moment of anticipation just before fulfillment, just before the consummation of the act, is the moment where it is still capable of existing in its perfection in the imagination, because once it takes place it becomes real, and of course it's always limited by the reality of the circumstance. At the moment before it actually happens is the moment where it can still exist in its ideal perfection in the imagination. In this poem, those elements preserved in the imagination are preserved in their perfection. And art, of course, preserves the imagination. So the Song of the Piper is superior to the actual music heard by the ear. The kiss of the lover is better in the imagination than it would be in reality, both because she won't fade and also because it's preserved in its perfection in the imagination. The third stanza: "Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young. All breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue." There's a lot of happiness going on here. Happy, happy boughs, happy love, more happy, happy love. So why are the boughs that can't shed their leaves are always caught in spring? Remember the pastoral world, and the happy melodist, forever piping songs forever new, and the happy love in the urn, why are those superior to the real world? And he makes it quite clear that forever warm and still to be enjoyed, and that still has that dual sense here, meaning frozen on the urn. They're still on the urn to be enjoyed, but also still meaning yet. So it means both always and yet to be enjoyed. Forever panting and forever young. And here's why. Because they are all breathing human passion far above. And this is a poetic inversion, anastrophe. He means that the love on the urn is far above all breathing human passion. It's a poetic inversion. Why is it far above all breathing human passion? Because human passion leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. The love and the music preserved in their perfection on the urn are far above the breathing human passion. Stanza 4. "Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadest thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return." Just in the interest of full disclosure, I have to point out this is one of those stanzas that it took me years to fully understand, or understand at least to the extent that I do understand them, not that I fully understand them. But this one took me a while to figure out. What does the village vacated by the villagers, and the villagers themselves going to sacrifice a heifer is an unbred female cow, as I said before, what does that have to do with the music preserved in perfection on the urn? Look at what's going on here. He says, "Who are these coming to the sacrifice?" So we know that there's a group of people who are coming to a sacrifice, taking a cow to the sacrifice, led by a mysterious priest who is leading that unbred female cow who's lowing at the skies, and she's all dressed up. Okay, so he's looking at this picture on the urn of a group of people leading a cow to a sacrifice. But instead of being able to answer the question, he doesn't know who they are. He turns to the town from which they have come. He says, "What little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is empty to this folk this pious morn?" So he imagines that the village that the people have left to go to the sacrifice now with empty streets. And so what will happen to these empty streets now? Well, obviously the people won't ever be coming back. "And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return." Why not? Well, There's two reasons. One of them is the sort of odd explanation of art. The people in the village have left the village and become frozen on the urn, and so they can't go back. It's sort of like a Twilight Zone episode where someone becomes frozen into a photograph. The real person becomes transmuted into a photograph and is now unable to go back to the real world. So to some extent, the people have left the village and walked into an art painting and become frozen on an urn. But there's also a real reason here as well. So where are these people now? Where are the people who have left the village to sacrifice this heifer? Well, they're dead. They aren't around anymore. There are no more people. How do we know these people even exist? Well, the only reason we know these people exist, the only reason we're able to talk about them at all, is that because they're preserved on the surface of the urn. They now live only in art. So the villagers live only in art. The people themselves have been dead for many, many, many generations. The dust from their decayed bodies has become other bodies over and over and over again, thousands of times since their death. They're long gone. They're completely forgotten, except that they now live in art. So in the world of art, they live forever, or at least as long as this urn remains unbroken, as long as it remains in a still, unravished bride of quietness. The people who have left the village now literally have walked into the perfect world of art and have become preserved there in the perfect world of art. Stanza 5. As opposed to just turning to another picture, in this stanza, the poet is now going to consider what this means. He says, "O Attic shape, fair attitude with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed. Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. Cold pastoral, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." O Attic shape. Attic is the adjectival form of Athenian. It means Athenian. So he's talking about the Greek shape. Fair attitude. In other words, this has adopted a fair or beneficial position or pose. With breed of marble men and maidens overwrought. Breed here literally means design. A breed is a design. But it also is a pun. Remember, there are two different kinds of puns. There is one in which a word has multiple meanings and you invoke multiple meanings simultaneously with the use of the word. And the other possibility of a pun are two words that sound alike but are spelled differently. And this is the second one. And so this breed also is reminiscent of the word breed as in race. This is an image peopled by marble men and maidens. And overwrought means literally written over. Wrought is the past participle of write, so overwrought means written over. So it is written over with a design depicting a race of marble men and maidens. Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. So how does the urn tease us out of thought as doth eternity? Can you conceive of eternity? Well, not really. Eternity is beyond conception. It's beyond thought. And you try to conceive of eternity, it will drive you past thought, because eternity is like sublime. It's ineffable. It's inconceivable. The urn, because it exists in a time that we can't conceive, teases us out of thought. It also teases us out of thought in another sense. Where will you be for eternity? Religious beliefs aside, you won't be here. We all die. And so the urn will survive us, or it's at least likely to survive us, as it has survived the Greeks. And since it has survived the Greeks, giving us that image, it is a cold pastoral. Cold pastoral for two reasons. One reason it's a cold pastoral is because it represents the pastoral world, but it represents it in a frozen form in the image. So as opposed to the warm living pastoral, there's the frozen pastoral of art. And it's also a cold pastoral in another sense because it will survive us and it really doesn't care about us because it exists in a realm beyond us. So that idea that it will outlive us, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man. Okay, so how is it a friend to man? Even though it will survive us, even though it's a cold pastoral, how does it serve as a friend to humanity? Well, it's a friend to humanity because it says, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that's all you know on earth and all you need to know. The gloss after beauty is truth, truth, beauty, the footnote number 8 there, probably is telling you that Keats had two manuscript versions of this poem. One, there were quotation marks around beauty is truth, truth, beauty, and one, there were no quotation marks. And it leaves it appropriately ambiguous. Is the urn saying beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that's all you know on earth and all you need to know? Or is the urn saying beauty is truth, truth, beauty, and then the poet is saying that's all you know on earth and all you need to know? That leaves us in sort of an ambiguous state. Now, they've elected to put the quotation marks in, but it would also be appropriate and interesting to leave the quotation marks out, because the urn is also telling us, or the poet is interpreting the urn to tell us, that all we can know is the truth of beauty and the beauty of truth that is preserved in the world of art, because we can't live in the world of art. We can only live in the real world. The world of art is something that we can, to borrow from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, we can apprehend but not comprehend. We can grasp at but not understand, because it is beyond our conception. We can't live there. That's why it teases us out of thought. You can't live in art, Woody Allen movies notwithstanding. All we can know is what art shows us, the truth that art shows us. So this becomes a negative capability poem. Remember, negative capability is the ability of remaining in a state of doubt or uncertainty without irritably reaching after fact or conclusion. The poem is actually leaving us in that state. It's showing us the beauty of art that exists in the eternal realm, but it's showing us also that we can't be there, which is one of the reasons why the poem itself has a sad elegiac tone, because at the same time the poet recognizes the beauty of art preserved beyond the ravages of time, he also recognizes that we actually live in a world that is subject to the ravages of time, that we can't be a still and ravished bride. The last idea I want to leave you with when you think about this poem is an idea that was put forth by Cleanth Brooks. Cleanth Brooks was a professor of literature, was also the poet laureate of the U.S. And in an essay in a book called The Well-Wrought Urn, the book is The Well-Wrought Urn, and the first chapter is called The Well-Wrought Urn, he offers what is one of the most brilliant readings of this poem. And one of the things he points out in his reading is that this is very much a meta-poem, because just as Keats perceives Greeks preserved in art on the urn and knows of them only because they now exist in the eternal unchanging world of art, we also perceive Keats' urn through his poem. So his poem actually becomes the well-wrought urn. It is the thing that preserves the urn for us, because we don't know where the actual urn is. We can't find it. We certainly can't go see it if we don't know where it is. The only way we're going to know about this urn, the only way this urn exists for us, and in fact the only way Keats exists for us really, is in literature, is in the poem. So the poem now becomes what preserves in the perfection of art, the art of the Greeks, just as the urn preserved the art of the Greeks. So it's very much a meta moment, a moment where the poem is doing what it describes the urn doing, and the art of the art, as it's represented in the poem, is what we're given. Now, next, we're going to be turning to Shelley, and we're going to be looking at Shelley's defense of poetry, which was a serious response to a satirical essay written by a friend defending poetry from the charges laid in jest by his friend, but laid seriously by other writers about poetry being useless. And he is going to defend poetry's usefulness, and he's going to do it using the same basic belief system that Keats is representing in this poem of Neoplatonic value of art. Art can take us to truth, which is inaccessible directly.